This is probably one of the last programs that I will lay down during the lockdown period, so I've gone back to an old favourite. 5 should be 6. The story of English pottery. Making basic pottery is very simple. It requires only 2 things: clay and the sun as a source of heat. Clay is a natural suspension of solid particles in a liquid that is sufficiently dehydrated to become a plastic mass. That is to say, a mass able to be formed into a shape that is retained after forming. And the source of heat is initially to drive out all the water without changing the formed shape, and this turns the plastic mass into a semi-robust solid object that may have decorative or even utility purposes. The first pottery was simply left out in the sun to dry. It made small containers that were useful for carrying seeds, berries, and other small foodstuffs. Ingenious people would put their pots near the fire to heat and cook the food. And someone would discover that the greater heat of the fire had fundamentally changed the nature of the clay pot. It would not be long before sun-dried pots were deliberately being put into and near a fire so that the intense heat could bring about the chemical change in the clay. It became vitrified, and it could even hold liquids. Then it was discovered that putting the pottery into an oven gave even better results. The potter and the potter's kiln came into being. Early pottery resembled what most children have made at school: pinchware, where the thumb and fingers are used to pinch out a shape in the clay, and coilware, where the clay is rolled into a long sausage that is then spiraled to form a container. Almost all useful pottery is round in shape, so the potter soon began to shape his work on the wheel. Indeed, it is probable that the potter made use of the wheel before it was used for transport. If we look at a map of the ancient world, pottery begins in the Middle East, in Egypt, the Levant, and ancient Greece. It then migrates west to Italy, where the Etruscans, the Sarmatians, and later the Romans all made extensive pots. The Romans then carried their pottery into northern Europe. In the meantime, a thriving pottery had been going in India, which had probably derived from the Chinese pottery industry, which existed before written history. When the Romans came to Britain, they brought with them roads. One road, called Watling Street, went from London to Dover, which is modern Chester. But as the road crossed the West Midlands, a road diverted to go north, travelling to Carlisle and serving the west end of Hadrian's Wall. Another road, called Ermine Street, went from London to the strategic town of Lincoln, Lindum. As it went through the Midlands, this road was crossed by a road from Camulodunum through Rattay, modern Leicester, to Diva, modern Chester, and on to Mona, the Isle of Anglesey. Where these two roads crossed, the Romans built a fort. They found open woodland to provide wood for building and also for fuel. And the Romans also found an abundance of fine-textured, high-quality red marl clay. The Romans built a significant pottery community around the fort, using the red marl clay found in the area. Some of the ware made at this pottery went back into mainland Europe, and the potteries must have been quite famous. But when the Romans went, the pottery also went. Some 500 years later, the same area was famous all over the world as the North Staffordshire potteries, the Five Towns. And the man responsible for that title is an author whose books included The Clayhanger Saga, The Card, and Hannah of the Five Towns. In Victorian times, this author was as famous and popular as Charles Dickens. He was, of course, Arnold Bennett, of Five Towns fame, who, in his fictitious Five Towns of Turnhill, Bursley, Hanbury, Knype, and Longshaw, modelled the potteries towns of Tunstall, Burslem, Hanley, Stoke, Longton, and Fenton. Fenton? Where did Fenton come from? Well, surprisingly, Arnold Bennett never wrote about Fenton, even though it was one of the pottery's main towns and had been there since the time of the Romans. No one really knows why Fenton was left off Bennett's list. But it means that 5 should really be 6. The story of the English pottery. We now know that in pre-Roman times, Iron Age Celts used local brown marl fireclay to make funeral urns and storage vessels. These were usually coilware and pinchware, decorated by incised marks and clay smears, and sun-dried or fired in fire pits. The Romans introduced wheel-thrown pottery and early salt glazings, which went far and wide through Britannia and into Gallic Europe. But the best Roman wares were imported from Italy and Rome itself. In medieval times, the local potters used coal to fire their kilns. The increased temperatures gave a more robust body and better glazing. And these local medieval potters made the first breakthrough for the area. They had already gained enough skill to make reliable and consistently sized butter pots. Yes, butter pots. The nearby town of Uttoxeter was nationally famous for its butter market. The sale of butter was controlled by the King's law. North Staffordshire potters became specialists in making the pots that complied with the government's weights and measures legislation. Their butter tubs controlled the market. And 16th century journeyman potters from around the country began to concentrate in the potteries area, building a unique English skill base. But this is not yet an English industry centre. By the 16th century, there were already some 50+ potteries concentrated around the Delft area in Holland. Delft was already an industrial centre, but why Delft? Delft was on the end of the Dutch East India Company trade route from China. The best pottery available at this time is Izingware that was being imported from China into Holland by the Dutch East India Company. And the Delft potters made a reasonable copy. So the Dutch industry thrived on its replication of Izingware. Then in 1672, William of Orange became William III of England and William II of Scotland. He invited some Dutch artisans to come to England. Among these were two brothers, who were silversmiths by royal appointment. Early in the 1690s, the Eller brothers, John Philip and David, came from Holland as silversmiths in London. And later, they set up a commercial pottery at Bradwell Woods, Newcastle-under-Lyme, using the same local brown marl fireclay that had been so admired by the Romans. They quickly realized that the local clay gave an almost exact colour match to the Izingware and the Delft copies. John Philippe stayed in Newcastle and made the ware at Bradwell Woods, and David sold it from their silversmith shop in London. The secret of their innovative ware is deflocculated slip cast into plaster of Paris moulds, the first great secret of the potteries. John Asprey was a young man from Burslem who wanted to learn the Ellers' secrets. He got a job with them, and for 10 years he pretended to be a feeble-minded mute, so that the Ellers would be less protective about their secrets when they were around him. Eventually, Asprey learned all the secrets about their redware, and in 1710 John and his nephew Thomas set up a pottery in Burslem. The Aspreys were more dedicated businessmen who successfully overtook the Ellers' business. One day in 1715, Thomas Asprey set off for London to see their continental agent. He was riding his own horse and planned to take a gentle 5 days for the journey. When he reached Leighton Buzzard, where he planned to stay the night, he found his horse had developed an eye infection. The local farrier said he would deal with it. Intrigued, Asprey stayed to watch. The farrier went into the road and picked up a flint pebble, which he threw into his forge. When the flint was glowing red hot, he took it out of the fire and hammered it into a fine powder. He blew the powder into the horse's eye, and the next morning the eye was clear. But Asprey was not so much impressed by the magical cure. He had seen the pure whiteness of the calcined flint powder, a pure white powder that might be included into a clay body. He immediately rode back to his works in Burslem to experiment with an idea. Thomas Asprey soon discovers that when calcined flint is added to the local red marl clay, the product made and fired becomes cream in colour. This is the secret of Asprey's creamware, which is the real foundation of the Burslem pottery industry. This is the origin of Staffage's earthenware. Late 1720s, and Thomas Wealden, Asprey's nephew, founds a pottery to make earthenware and develop new glazes and decorating techniques. Wealden also recruits two of the future giants of the industry and teaches them the new ceramic manufacturing techniques. These are Josiah Spode and Josiah Wedgwood. The potteries are about to be born. The Eller brothers had their factory here. But what does the geology of the area offer? The 6 towns more or less form a line down the Trent Vale. Coincidentally, this line is located where high-quality marl clay is found at or near the surface, as depicted by this dark shaded area. Then a further coincidence was instrumental in founding an industry. The entire area is above rich coal seams, and local to the 6 towns, these seams come right up to the surface. And beyond the coal measures, millstone grits provide a source for the latest ingredient of flints. Clay, the means of making a shape, and coal, a means of heat to fire it, and flint, the clay body lightener. So the potteries are rich with coal, sometimes mined from a vertical shaft, where a shaft is driven down, head workings lower a cage, and the miners tunnel into the seams of coal. And sometimes it can be mined from a drift or footrel mine, where you simply dig into an embankment and find the coal seam near the surface. The vertical shaft can draw up the cage with the coal in it to be piled at the pit head, and with the footrel mine you can simply walk the coal out with a horse pulling a tub and again pile the coal at the pit head. In Roman times the clay was important. By the 1600s coal becomes the method of firing, and the industry really starts with earthenware in the 1700s. Typical earthenware and creamware from the early Wealden factories takes the world markets by storm. Underglaze painting and salt glazing, print decorations that are both self-coloured and also hand-finished by painters. Soon, the decorated earthenware potteries of Burslem, the ceramic floor tiles of Tunstall, and the clay pipes of Newcastle-under-Lyme are spreading North Staffage's reputation for ceramics far and wide. Just a minute. Clay pipes from Newcastle under Lyme. Are we now saying there are 7 potteries towns? Tunstall, Burslem, Hanley, Stoke, Longton, Fenton, and Newcastle under Lyme? Well, yes, at the moment we are. A quick look at the geography shows Newcastle under Lyme is the confluence of most local routeways. It's where the Ellers first set up their potteries. It's bigger and older than any of the 6 towns. Newcastle's roads were turnpikes, the main routes from north and south. Newcastle prospered from the tolls of all the potteries towns, importing materials via Liverpool and reaching the London markets in the south. It cost £3 for every ton in 1760. Newcastle's market was established by charter in 1142, so it became an obvious centre for all the local pottery distribution. In 1780, one Josiah Wedgwood will set about breaking Newcastle's control of the market and transport links. Josiah Wedgwood was born in Burslem in 1730 into a family with long traditions as potters. His father died when he was 9, and the family pottery was run by an uncle and 2 cousins. By Josiah's own death in 1795, at the age of 65, he was the acknowledged father of the entire English pottery industry. The family pottery was in Burslem, where Josiah finished his elementary education. At the age of 12, his uncle arranged for Josiah to enter a 5-year apprenticeship with Thomas Wealden. During his apprenticeship, young Wedgwood experimented with new bodies and decoration techniques and became a true ceramic scientist. He finally joins the family firm and launches his signature products, such as Sprigg jasperware and black basaltware decorated pat-to-pat. This is a complicated process where liquid slip is painted layer by layer onto the ware so that it forms a relief sculpture. Sprigware is a less expensive, more quickly produced form of a similar decorative effect. Josiah Wedgwood established many of the scientific methods used in commercial ceramics to the present day, probably influenced by his great friend Erasmus Darwin, who is grandfather of the famous Charles Darwin. Friendship with Darwin gave Wedgwood access to scientists, engineers, and industrialists centred in the West Midlands during the Industrial Age. Wedgwood was a keen member of the Lunatic Society. The potteries are based in the North West Midlands. To the south is the city of Birmingham, with its tinsmiths and engineers. Between the two is the Black Country, famous for its nail makers and wire pullers, and between those two is Colebrook Dale, famous for the development of iron and steel. In between the four is the town of Wolverhampton, which is also convenient for Lichfield, which is where Erasmus Darwin was living at the time. The Lunatic Society met at Wolverhampton once a month. But the members wanted to get back to their places of work in time for the following day, so they travelled back at night time. Horse and horse-drawn transport was dangerous at this time, so the Lunatic Society met on the night of the full moon. He developed new bodies and decorating techniques while searching for the Greek and Etruscan styles of classical pottery. He became rich by improving earthenware and registering the goods as Queensware after Queen Charlotte. He did this with a clever trick. He sent a 1,000-piece dinner service to Queen Charlotte and promised to replace any broken pieces once a year, providing he could call his pottery Queensware. Of course, Queen Charlotte agreed, and he made his fortune with everyone who was anyone wanting to own the same pottery as the Queen. In 1769, he built his Etruria factory specifically to make Queensware. He then used some of his fortune to overturn the Cookworthy patent on using kaolin, Cornish white clay, allowing himself and others to compete directly with the European porcelain manufacturers. Cornish kaolin, white clay, is mined hydraulically by squirting pressurized water into the quarry face and washing the clay out. It is used in ceramics, papermaking, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and the like. Cookworthy was an apothecary in Plymouth who bought a very small kaolin quarry in Cornwall. He founded a pottery in Plymouth to make continental-style porcelain and managed to establish a royal patent that said he was entitled to royalties on the use of kaolin, mined from any location, for any purpose, and in the production of ceramic wares in the whole of Britain. After long court battles, Wedgwood established that a patent can only protect the artifacts, not the natural resources from which they are made. Soon, Wedgwood and the Stoke potters, who had supported him in his legal battles, were able to produce porcelain of a similar quality to that from the continent by substituting white kaolin clay for the local brown marl. Hopefully, you can even see from these photographs how much finer kaolin pottery is compared with Wealden's earlier earthenware efforts. You might also remember that we mentioned a contemporary of Wedgwood who was also to become one of the great pioneers of the industry. This was Josiah Wedgwood. In the 1780s, the Chinese were still stealing the high end of the tableware market in Britain with imports of hard-paste porcelain. It was translucent and very delicate in form because hard-paste porcelain contains feldspar, which could stand very, very high firing temperatures without damage, which changed the whole chemistry of the pottery. It is said that Josiah Wedgwood was reading a Chinese text in translation about the secret Chinese manufacturing techniques. The text said the refractive products, which we now know as feldspar, formed the skeleton of the ware. But in places the word skeleton had been mistranslated, and it read the bone of the ware. Wedgwood wondered what would happen if we used ground calcined bone in place of flints. Wedgwood's overthrow of Cookworthy's patent on kaolin coincides with Spode's other happy accident in the pottery's mythology. Josiah Spode discovers English translucent bone china, which becomes the backbone product of the top end of the pottery industry. Soon, bone china is a unique and very competitive product. The introduction of calcined animal bones to replace the flint and kaolin to replace the marl. English because it was made nowhere else in the world. Translucent because the bone allowed light to penetrate the body fired at much higher temperatures. Bone because that was the key ingredient to keeping the shape. And china for two reasons. Firstly, it copied Chinese manufactured porcelain in style and quality. And secondly, it allowed the genteel drinking of China tea, a very expensive beverage at this time. At first, the introduction of bone china produced a ceramic body that could rival French and German soft paste and Chinese hard paste porcelains, and copied their blue on white decoration, quickly leading to works such as this. The true art forms of English pottery. Leave the Five Towns via Longton and travel east. Go through Uttoxeter, which created the Five Towns' first market, and you reach the county city of Derby, with its own network of transport links. This is the journey taken by Andrew Planchet in 1750 to set up the Crown Derby pottery, to take advantage of Derby's cheaper communication links. And 150 years later, Crown Derby Amare pattern actually becomes currency for the British travelling folk. Crown Derby is a pottery that migrated from Longton of the Six Towns to gain access to new markets. With white translucent porcelain now being produced in North Staffordshire, and fine earthenware and queensware, and cast figures of people and animals by Dalton, Beswick, Minton et al., and hard, beautiful encrusted tiles from Twyford, Shanks, and Hollins, the industry was well set. But with all the technical and production advantages in place, Newcastle under Lyme still had the North Staffordshire transport links. Again, enter Mr. Wedgwood to change the entire economy of North Staffordshire. Wedgwood organised a consortium of local businessmen to join him in financing a canal system to connect the Six Towns with their supplies of Cornish white clay and Devon blue clay, and then get their goods to the market in the south. And they employed the great canal builder James Brindley. Potteries quickly began to gather beside the canals, literally the pot bank. And wherever the canals were found, the potteries built beside them. and soon the pot bank even applied to potteries that were nowhere near a canal. And when steam took over from the canals, the pot bank was still the popular name for a ceramics factory. And by the mid to late 1800s, the potteries covered the landscape, and on Thursday afternoon, darkness descended to cover the earth. It needed an average of 12 tons of coal to fire 1 ton of ceramic product. The means of heat has to be from coal to reach the high temperatures that are now required, and most pieces required 3, 4, and sometimes even 10 firings in the kilns. It's fortunate that we remember Stoke is also a major centre in the Staffordshire coalfields. This beautiful work came from this industrial mess. It became known as smoke on stench. In keeping with the garden town fashion, the Wedgwoods moved their factory to the rural setting of Barlaston, which is where it can be found to this day. And the Potteries celebrated their industry with pride. In 1925, the city of Stoke-on-Trent was formed with a motto that roughly translates as "Strength comes from unity." The polycentric geography of the city shows a line of towns with no obvious centre. The 6 towns joined together. Stoke-upon-Trent is the full name of the town of Stoke. The town of Hanley becomes the city centre. Newcastle-under-Lyme is invited to join and definitely says no. And Stoke-on-Trent becomes the city. 1925 is celebrated as the epoch of Potter's pride. And it is commemorated in works of fine art. But the industry is killing its people. Carbon dioxide found in the atmosphere gives rise to chronic bronchitis with much of the population. Carbon monoxide, also in the atmosphere, is poisonous. Sulfur dioxide is sometimes in such concentration that when it rains dilute sulfuric acid. Chlorine gas was used in the First World War as a weapon. Lead fumes give rise to mental difficulties for adults and children alike. Coal dust and borax dust give rise to pneumoconiosis, and silica dust give rise to silicosis, known in the industry as Silly Jack. This is a view across Hanley in the early 1950s. But coal firing is to end with the Clean Air Act of 1956. We must be careful what we wish for. Removing the advantage of local coal to fire the pottery industry would be the death knell of the potteries in the 6 towns. But not many people knew that in 1956. The advantage of local coal to fire the pottery has kept costs down. Its removal sent the industry to the cheaper resources of Southeast Asia. And by 1990, almost the entire pottery industries of Stoke has disappeared. But so has the pollution. The end of the potteries, but also the end of the blight of smoke on stench. After almost 400 years, the potteries are still proud of their heritage, with museums, visitor centres, and working potteries in the traditional style, which we have already visited. So here's hoping that soon we'll all meet again at the North Muscombe Rural Community Centre. We'll see you all then. Goodbye now.